endless in a way because there's so many. If you go to Yad Vashem, there's a special, not Yad Vashem, excuse me. If you go to Auschwitz, and I have been to Auschwitz about 14 times, there is a barrack at Auschwitz one that is dedicated only to the Jewish experience. And it's set up very similar to Yad Vashem. Auschwitz is regarded, we're working backwards, as a museum today. I mean, when you go there, it says museum. So in this barrack, at the very end, they have these very large laminated pieces of paper. It's all laminated, and they hang kind of like the way clothes hang down at dry cleaners. And it's alphabetized and in very, very, very small print. And it's a big room, and it looks like when you go into a dry cleaner, you see all these clothes. Each of these little, very thin, fully laminated sheets that are, I would say probably 4.5 to 5 feet tall and wide, probably fit 3 or 4 columns, are the names that they have. So you can go and you can look up and maybe find a relative there. It's still, the enormity of I want to talk first about the enormity of the Holocaust before we go into the history. The enormity of the Holocaust is very hard to conceptualize because of the total number. But each of those individuals were living human beings. They had life, they had community, they had purpose, they had families. And I was involved in a project involving, as you know, cemetery restoration. And it was only in the cemeteries where I had the sense of the enormity and the tragedy of the loss, because the cemeteries were so unkept. I mean, they were just a bit neglected. Why? Because there were no Jews there, and Jews had lived in these small villages for generations and generations, and they would upkeep the cemetery, but there was nobody there to do that. And the non-Jewish sector did not, they were not wealthy, even though it would have been a mitzvah for them to have kept up the Jewish cemetery and made sure that it was well kept. There's only one cemetery that we did where a woman took it upon herself to keep the headstones fresh, painted, and so forth. So that's where the enormity, because you sit in these very small, then you think about 6 million, and then you begin to sense, because you're looking at somebody whose name is on the headstone, the matzeva, and that's where, for me, where I got a sense of the enormity and tragedy of the Holocaust. It's, beyond words. So let's start with religious anti-Semitism. I don't want my remarks to focus that, the Christian Catholic anti-Semitism was the cause, because there are multiple factors involved.
We are not offended.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm saying it as a statement of fact. It wasn't simply the ingrained nature of anti-Semitism. We'll talk about some of the other factors, the economic factors, the relations, the time period from the end of World War I to 1932, and the rise of Hitler, the rise of the Nazi Party, and how the U.S. Inadvertently gave some credence to the Nazi philosophy. So let's start a little bit before all of this happened with, because I believe that history is connected, events are connected. even ideas and thoughts, and we'll see this, are connected and have a relationship. Is it the cause? No. Is it a cause? Probably. So let's take a look at the religious a professor at the University of Chicago wrote a book, and I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it. I think you've read it, Anti-Judaism.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I've read a number of books.
Yeah, the idea is that we often conflate anti-Semitism, which is more racial, which is more peoplehood oriented, with anti-Judaism. And I believe it's David Nierenberg is the professor, wrote a book called Anti-Judaism. And he traces the polemic against Judaism from early rise of Christianity all the way up to modern times, including the Nazi period, or the 1930s and 1940s. And it's his position, I think, if you want to try to summarize it, is that you needed Judaism to form a polemic to justify Christianity, whether it was deicide and the Jewish involvement in the death of Christ. For example, Jews were blamed for the death of Christ. The way there are passages in the New Testament that suggest a blaming of the Jews. The Jews are often a polemic in terms of what is correct Christian behavior, i.e., perfect behavior through studying how Jesus lived his life. And usually the polemic is involving the Pharisees and involving that. And that was preached, for a long period of time. And that got into the hearts and the souls of people, of Catholics. Luther felt that if in the Reformation,
Right.
that by creating a kind of watered down version, that Jews would flock therefore and join, and when they didn't, that again led to an anti-Jewish position on behalf of Luther. And as I've said before, for Jews living in the Galut, in the exile in Europe, Western Europe, and so forth, the dividing line was belief in Jesus, was the belief in Jesus Christ, and Jews were very, we were very stiff-necked. We were very firm in our belief that our exile was a result of our sins, and that the nations of the world were instrumentalities of God, and that led to the exile. It didn't lead to a giving up of life or a giving up of hope that one day we would merit the return, but we did not see that as a rejection of God, by God, only a form of punishment, but that one day we would return. Now, that was sort of the theology to some extent, if you read some of the liturgy. So the Jews, wherever they went, they were limited in terms of what they could or could not do, and some of that involved collecting taxes on behalf of the king or on behalf of the province wherein they lived. And they would collect taxes not only within the Jewish town, but also in the Christian sector as well. And so when times would get rough for the Christian community, for example, the king would say, well, who's to blame? It's the people that are going and collecting. The Jews were always kind of in the middle of all of that. And we all know about 1492 and the exiles from Spain, which was calamitous, the forced conversions. And even when they converted, they were suspect. So the Jew was never going to be fully accepted into society. there was always going to be suspicion that they were secretly practicing Judaism and that their views and that their theology would come to infect, so to speak, Catholicism or later Protestantism. The Jews were exiled from England in 1250, 1492, obviously Spain. Jews living in Russia, for example, were, Fiddler on the Roof was not too far off in terms of the rough nature of their existence. And as we know, at one point, they were forced out of various districts and forced into an area that was called the Pale of Settlement, which embraced, I believe, Belarus, white Russia. But it was an impoverished area where they could only basically be farmers. So life was not easy. I'm really painting with a broad brush, but really, and I've talked a little bit about Shabtai Tzvi, and Messianism, and the Jewish perspective on that, and some alienation really within Judaism that you had to be highly educated in order to practice being Judaism. Then we have the rise of Hasidism. But throughout, up to the Age of Enlightenment, beginning in about the 18th century, Napoleon in 1812, there grew a view that you didn't have to be a Christian to be loyal to the state. That you could be, as long as you pledged your loyalty to the state, you could practice any religion. It didn't matter. And so Jews, obviously in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe because they didn't have that, flocked to that. And Jews became lawyers, and Jews became doctors, and Jews became more merchant-oriented than they were before. And their lives improved dramatically, beginning in the late 18th and then all throughout the 19th century. I'm just I'm painting a very broad picture because we do want to get to 1932. We want to get to 1927 within the United States, and what was the situation in Germany. So you had already the seeds of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. You didn't have yet the hatred for Jews based on their blood. And that became a different equation. And so therefore, up to the time of the rise of Nazism, it was always what the individual believed that at the core mattered. And so long as the Jew held his tongue and was quiet, there'd be occasional pogroms and there'd be occasional killings that were absolutely brutal and terrible. And there were economic circumstances that led to Jews living in poverty. There were laws in various European countries that discriminated against Jews in terms of their businesses and so forth. And the way the system worked, Jews in these smaller towns developed, they were merchants. In part, I'm not sure about this, about owning land and so forth. The Christian communities in many of these small villages were farmers. They had trades and things like that. Many in the Jewish community had shops and stores, whether they were grocery stores or whether they were like general stores and so forth, or specific products that were needed, coats and things like that. And what they would do is they would sell to non-Jews. Christians would come and buy, and Jews would extend credit. In exchange, they would charge interest, right? So that led to resentment. Why? Because, well, the Christian got the coat, and the coat was listed, say, for $50, right, or 50 zlotys, whatever the case it may be. But they were paying, by the time they were all done, they might be paying 100 zlotys for the coat, and that they had worn and are now worn out, and they were still paying interest. That too, because Christians were not allowed, I believe, to charge interest in their business at the time. That too fueled the anti-Semitism, fueled the sense of the Jew being different, and the Jews lived in segregated communities. I've said this, so many times. One of the lessons that I think we can learn that's often forgotten, and that I only learned about it when I traveled and when I went to these smaller communities, was that the Jews lived over here, and the Christians or Catholics lived over here. They were separate communities. Outside of business, they had very little social interaction. Market day, some of them attended public schools together. But outside of that, there wasn't the kind of openness. I know this isn't popular, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Those were concepts that were not, they weren't concepts that were part of Eastern European society, we'll say it that way. Not that everybody hated the Jews. I mean, not that all Christians and Catholics and so forth, they didn't all hate the Jews, but they didn't consider the Jewish plight, with rare exception, to be their problem. And so when things got terrible, it was every person for themselves, and they didn't see the problem that the Jews were having as their problem, because these neighborhoods were, for the most part, these villages, largely segregated. Some of it intentional, on the part of the Jewish people, and some of it unintentional as well. And so we say, well, why didn't the Christians, being good Christians, why didn't they do more? I mean, we see, films about Bonhoeffer, Oskar Schindler, and but the vast majority did nothing. Did very, very little. The vast majority did nothing, and there were a few who did something. But that was part of the underlying culture that existed. And of course, war changes everything, and it takes a special person to be able to do the right thing when your life is on the line. Yes.
Even among the Christians, there was divisions: Protestants versus Catholic, Northern Ireland, the religious wars of the with the Hanseatic League and all of that. I mean, it's the human condition to want to segregate themselves rather than join.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. That's what can make, I'll say it this way, can make the United States special, in that while it's not a dedicated melting pot, it still affords us the opportunity to interact and mix with people from different backgrounds and different cultures, and therefore you form relationships, and you can form coalitions, so that when things hit you that say the government is doing, you're not alone. It's not just a Jewish problem, or it's not just a Black problem. It becomes a problem of a larger community, because everyone feels affected by that, because of the underlying interaction that people have and the experience they have with people who are different than they are. So, okay. So that's, again, this is all background. So now let's, move us up a little bit. I've really oversimplified, and for those who are online or are going to listen to this, please understand that it's a lot more complex. I've only dedicated 2 times to the study of Shoah, and then we'll conclude with Israel. I'm going to digress also a little bit. We talked a little bit about Theodor Herzl and his contribution, but he said, and his basic premise was, that anti-Semitism was never going to go away. You were always going to have the Alfred Dreyfus affair. And so the idea that if the Jew pledged loyalty to the state, that would rid Western civilization of this inbred anti-Semitism was a fallacy. And the only way he felt that would happen is to actually, that the Jews as a people needed their own homeland. And that would rid, because the Jew would never be accepted in France. Why? Because they're not Frenchmen. They're not English. They're not, and he based that on the Dreyfus and things that he'd heard during the Dreyfus affair. So he formed, as a way of escape, his vision was to move all the Jews out of Europe, those that wanted to come, buy land that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, land that was in Israel, and through illegal means, purchase enough land that Jews would be able to come and build a life for themselves. And that, he felt, would rid the world of anti-Semitism. We know that in that respect, he was wrong, because, all one has to do is look at the situation today and realize that anti-Semitism and hate, is not a bad theory. It's part of the human condition. So let's move into the end of World War I. Some of this history, I'm sure this is, standard stuff you learn in high school. The World War I was a brutal war. It was terrible. All wars are terrible. We sometimes underplay World War I because we look at World War II. But World War I was terrible, a terrible war. At the end of World War I, out of retribution, without much foresight, the Versailles Treaty was signed, and that imposed enormous obligations on the Germans to make reparations. And their economy just could not, in the long run, support the terms of the treaty. So now we're going to move quickly into the 1920s and talk about a couple of events in the United States that I think are worthwhile, because what's going to happen when Hitler comes to power, he doesn't begin with genocide. He doesn't begin to build death camps until the 1940s, 1941. The first real operational death camp was in 1942. There were three. It was Belchek, it was Sobibor, and it was Treblinka. There were three major ones. That's 1942. That's about 10 years after he's first appointed chancellor. So people think, Hitler comes to power and we get Auschwitz. No, and Auschwitz, by the way, doesn't become really the Auschwitz until mid-1943 and then 1944 in particular, with the Hungarian Jewish. That's when, that's on down the road, and we'll come to that. So in the 1920s, there began to develop something called eugenics. And eugenics posited the idea that a group's genetic makeup impacted on the greater society. And combined with that, the utility of a person had to be based on whether they could support themselves and not be wards of the state. And if they had to be wards of the state, that would be a burden upon the state. And what became popular in the 1920s, sadly, I say, is the notion that if you had certain groups of people who suffered from a genetic defect, including mental, included alcoholism, Huntington's disease, and a few others, then they would become wards of the state. They'd have to be institutionalized, and that was an expense. And therefore, many states passed sterilization laws. Sterilization.
The states as in.
States like
United States
California,
or
California,
countries.
Alabama, many states did that. So that if someone had had children and who couldn't support them, couldn't take care of them because of their own situation, and they were institutionalized, with due process, with a court hearing, the court could order the individual sterilized. And that was the law. And I'm going to guess, Ashford, that you're familiar with the case of Buckview. Anyone who really has studied Holocaust knows that this was knows about the case of Buck v. Bell. So in Buck v. Bell, and if I butcher the facts, you'll correct me. Seriously. I forget her first name. I want to say Virginia Bell, but I think it was in the state of Virginia. That's right.
It was in Virginia.
Yeah, it was in Virginia.
Yeah.
They had a sterilization law, and this woman, Miss Bocas, called her Miss Bell. I forget her first name.
It wasn't Virginia.
No, it wasn't Virginia. It wasn't Janet. I'm trying to make up names in my head.
It's been a long time since I looked at that.
Yeah, but her mother was also a ward of the state. And so the defendant in the case had, I think, 2 or 3 children, I think 3 children.
Mm-hmm.
And the state brought an action to have her sterilized. And there was due process. She could bring whatever, she could have an attorney and so forth and have a hearing. And the state ordered, the state court ordered her to be sterilized under the statute. Made a finding that she was unable to support herself, that she suffered from a disease that was listed, what they used in those words in those times, mental retardation. She didn't have all of her family.
Maybe Down syndrome or something.
Down syndrome. There were all kinds of diseases that were chromosomal in nature, were genetic in nature. And the theory behind it wasn't for their benefit. The theory behind it was, why should the state support these people having children? They can't take care of them, therefore they shouldn't have children. And if they did, then we're going to sterilize them so this kind of thing stops. So the utility, the citizenship sort of, your right to constitutional right, so to speak, was dependent on if you were normal, if you could support yourself, and pay taxes to the state and to the federal government. You had some utilitarian value towards the greater good. That case went up to it was affirmed by the state Supreme Court, and then they filed what's called a writ of certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court took the case. And they found that her due process rights were not violated. And in a very tragic statement by the great, quote, Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who you may have heard of, one of the great justices, one of the great legal jurists of American jurisprudence, tragically tarnished his image by saying 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And they upheld. And to this day, if I'm not mistaken, Buck v. Bell has not been overturned.
The problem is how can you say that a non-compos mentis can be represented by anyone with due process?
Right.
That was the argument. If you made the argument before the court today, that would be my argument. I have a retarded brother. I'm his servant. I'm the one that takes care of him.
Yeah.
And to say that, he got to understand whatever might be said to him.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a conundrum and a flaw in all of it.
Oh, of course. But you get a sense because law is based in part on philosophy and based on societal values. And you can already see, I hope you can already see, that, by the time in this case, 1927, one would imagine that the Nazi Party, which is not a group of imbeciles and not a group of crazies as they were made out to be, to some extent a criminal conspiracy in the Nuremberg trials, but these people were intelligent. They were not stupid. I mean, Hitler and so forth, but they were. The theory is that they were watching the United States to see if they could justify what they were about to set out to do in the 1930s as they came to power. Also, if I'm not mistaken, IBM sold pre-computers to the Nazi Party. They profited, and some of those machines were used to tabulate and to keep track of the Jews that were killed and where they were located. I mean, it's very complicated. But there was a book. There was an IBM in the Holocaust, and that was problematic. But with the collapse of the world economy in 1929, inflation was, as you know, inflation was unbelievably bad, particularly in Europe, and there was, a fair amount of unrest and so forth. And in comes this Hitler and the National Socialist Democratic Party, who are obviously very right wing and who believes and posits the philosophy of Germany being a master race, being a race that was sold out by Jewish negotiators and so forth. And what was needed was a rebirth of Germany. And Hitler was an inspirational figure. Mixed in with that was his hatred and the group's hatred, not just him, for the Jews. And they adopted this blood philosophy that Germany, Aryan and so forth, that their blood could not be contaminated, that it was no longer what Jews believed that made the anti-Semitism. It was just their being human beings, or not really human beings, but in their eyes, subhuman. And therefore, you had to begin to think about laws that, not just laws about who could contribute and who couldn't contribute, but in this sense, Jewish blood would lower the overall Aryan blood, would contaminate the Aryan blood, such that this was the cause of their loss of World War I. This was the cause of all the problems that they were having. And so you had to segregate. You had to not allow Jews to be part of German society as they were before. And that was, and the first step you see in that are the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Let me backtrack for just a moment. Hitler's appointment as chancellor occurs a week after the Reichstag fire, and he suspends martial law. Before that time, Germany was a constitutional state with rights of protest. They had universal health care, I believe. They were a very advanced country at the time, but they were going through one of the worst parts of the Depression that any country went through.
And so, a large communist party too.
What's that?
They had a large communist party.
A large communist party, absolutely. There were like 49 or 50 different political parties in Germany in 1932, and no one got a majority. Hitler's party never got a full majority. And then the fire happened, and then he, as chancellor, suspended the Constitution and declared martial law. And of course, once that happened, he didn't unsuspend it. That it stayed. I mean, martial law stopped after a while, but the Reichstag became controlled by the Nazi Party, and political parties were outlawed. Especially communists were hunted down once that happened. So let us. So we now. I'm painting a very broad brush and leaving out certain details. But in 1935, we have the Nuremberg laws, and that begins to change things. As part of the Nuremberg laws, obviously it would be a crime to have sexual relations. A German could not have sexual relations with a Jew. It was defined who was a Jew. And if you could trace back, I think, 2 generations, then that person was Jewish, and that person had to be segregated. And then you have the anti-Semitism expressed that arises from that. Because now not only do you have the history of anti-Semitism, but now you've got the fuel of the hatred of blaming a particular group for their present plight or for their past plight, not because of what they believed or even what they did, but because they contaminated the Aryan race, and therefore had to be segregated and had to be separated and removed from German society. Now, let me digress for just a moment and talk about present day. Some people, myself included, get extremely nervous when people are rounded up, for whatever the reason, en masse, and shipped out of the country. Rightfully or wrongfully, whether they entered legally, whether they didn't enter legally, doesn't matter. But when people are rounded up, that strikes a nerve in the Jewish community. I don't think our present government really understands that, because the Shoah or the Holocaust is a seminal event, a defining event for us as Jews. And when things look like or come close, feels like, and I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it's not, I'm not saying that, this is completely unjustified and so forth. All I'm saying is that our reaction as a group to that kind of activity is chilling because of our history, and because we have chosen to look at the Shoah as a defining moment in Jewish history. We look at that as being an incredibly important event in Jewish identity. We teach the Shoah to our kids in religious school. We have them read books by Elie Wiesel and The Diary of Anne Frank, and we have Yom HaShoah commemoration services, unlike other historical events. So that, and particularly with the state of Israel, and I've talked about this, the reaction by Israel, whether you agree or disagree with that, and there's room for both, believe me, is the 1,200 Jewish lives were killed. And Israel has taken the history of the Shoah to say, never again. And when 1,200 Jewish souls were killed and murdered, and they were in Israel, no less, that's going to evoke a response that's beyond just political. It's going to evoke a response that goes to part of the heart of the Jewish soul, and that's part of what we're seeing. I'm not sure today, after all this time, whether it's solely that, but certainly the initial responses were fueled in part by that history. So let us move forward to 1938. We have the Jews beginning to be segregated, wearing the yellow star, and being kicked out of various unions. The practice of medicine lawyering, public service, they were removed from that. When we see, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just saying what our visceral response when we see mass firings, of people, and this person is disloyal and that, and we read that, whether it's accurate, whether it's not accurate, whether it's right or wrong is almost irrelevant. Those kinds of things stir up at some point of our consciousness the memory of what happened to the Jews in Germany. Okay. So now we get to 1938, and the anti-Semitism, or the Jewish hatred, I should say, has reached a lot, and there is a incident that takes place in France. A Jew whose parents have been detained, student, I believe, goes into the German embassy in Paris and shoots and kills the ambassador, or kills a high-ranking German official.
I think it was a high-ranking official.
It was a high-ranking, yeah, it wasn't the ambassador. Kills a high-ranking ambassador. And Hitler, of course, goes into a fury, particularly because somebody who's Jewish. And the government sponsors one of the worst pogroms in the history of Europe, Kristallnacht, where synagogues are destroyed and burned. The Jewish shops are attacked and destroyed. The Torahs are taken out of synagogues and burned. I mean, it's called it in English the night of broken glass, because there was so much glass that was shattered, particularly in Berlin and in others. This was a nationwide event, but mostly, I believe, the films that we see of Kristallnacht, I believe most of those films it takes place in Berlin
And Bavaria, I believe.
and Bavaria, yeah.
Because that's where the heartland of the Nazis was.
Yeah. So you had that going on, and that was really a turning point, because it was truly political, truly government initiated. There was no question about that. Do you have a time? I didn't bring the law.
Keep going.
Okay.
You love it.
Okay.
I'm having a great time.
Okay. In 1939, they begin to do experiments on people who fall into the same kind of category that took place in the 20s and 30s. Eugenics, by the way, became a very popular movement in the 30s as well in the United States. And of course, the Germans adopted that lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, that was their rationale for doing what they did. But in the 1939, many of the elderly, infirmed, and those who fell into the various categories, they were taken to sanitariums, sterilized, so forth. And we begin to get the taking of their life. They begin to look at ridding Germany of people who could not contribute to the state, people who needed the support of the state, needed care, needed the state to provide for their care as human beings. And in Germany at the time, and particularly as we're now getting into World War II and getting into the attack on Poland, which began the Second World War, Germany is building up militarily. And the thinking is, why should good German, what is good German blood being spilled for Is it to help those who cannot contribute? German blood should be spilled only for those that can strengthen the state. And these people, I use the parentheses, I use the quotation marks, could not contribute. These were infirmed people. These were people who suffered from, whose brains were not fully developed. Huntington's disease, alcoholism, where they couldn't, drunkards.
What about gypsies?
And were gypsies involved in the 1939? I know that they were rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. That I do know.
They were rounded up earlier, and when in 1939 they started looking at the gypsy populations and the memory deficients.
Yeah. So you see, as early as 1939.
Yes.
And so you had the beginnings of experiments to kill. I mean, for lack of a better word, groups of individuals, not Jews yet, but individuals who, through no fault of their own, could not meet the standard for life. One always worries, a humanitarian always worries about a government and its relationship to those who cannot, for whatever the reason, support themselves and require government assistance in some form, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's, again, if you're going to start talking about, well, what are the lessons of the Holocaust? One is, what kind of society are we going to create? Thank God we have a diverse group of religious institutions that value human life, and so the likelihood of something like that happening is there are some safeguards, or some societal safeguards in the respect for human life that you thought would exist in Germany, but obviously did not. That if they could permit that without huge protests and without demonstrations, if they could permit that, then one has to question the influence, the impact of religion upon the population. Not saying the religion is bad, I wouldn't say that, but would it motivate people politically to put a stop to that? Even Hitler was not comfortable with it, not because he was uncomfortable with taking those lives, but he feared that this could undermine his support, that it was a line that was being crossed. So that's one of the reasons they kept it very, very secret. But these kinds of things were beginning to happen in 1939. And as we're going to see in 1942, the impact of that policy, the impact of that insensitivity to human life for human life's sake. You had your hand up.
I was just thinking that possibly a lot of them didn't want to protest because of the brown shirts and those groups that Hitler had going around.
Yeah.
That, were
Sure.
taking them out.
There was fear.
And also they had begun to do medical experiments to see.
Yes. Yeah.
Kind of playing.
Yeah. The medical experiments began as early as 1939 on these individuals. And they were
cretins, as they call them.
I'll digress for just a moment because I hadn't intended to come to this, but now I taught a course with a medical ethicist and a physician called Physicians in the Holocaust. One of the issues that was raised, some of the research that occurred at Auschwitz was very good research. The laws, the research on hypothermia, for example, was yielded some significant findings. about what the human body could endure. Because they did that to see if their pilots, if they fell into the ocean, how long could they survive? And what were the effects of hypothermia? So they recreated those conditions at Auschwitz, and then of course took prisoners and they died from it. And they measured, stopwatch and whatever, measured the effects, temperature dropping, how long did they have, and so forth and so on. Question would arise is, could you use that research? Could you use the findings in today as part of valid research? Could you quote it? Could you do anything with it? And the answer to that presently among the scientific community is no. You can't use it because it's violated any kind of the Human Subjects Review Board, the IRBs, came out as a result of the doctors' trials that took place at Nuremberg. So you didn't have to necessarily have a patient's consent to do a medical experiment. You didn't have to disclose what it was you were going to do. There were ethics, but they were not binding like they are today. It's very different. But the point is that number one, this was terrible. But if you examine the purpose, you could see the rationality behind it in terms of what the state valued, what the people in power valued. They're about to go off to war, or they may already be at war. We're talking about 1939 and the invasion of Poland, right? And so you have on the one hand this invasion going on, and on the other hand, we want people that can serve the state. So I've made that point. And this goes on from about 1939 to about 1941, in part in secret, and in part you don't see the protests, you don't see the demonstration, because it's become a fascist state. And it becomes dangerous to oppose the government. It becomes dangerous to oppose Hitler. They take over Poland. And I believe at that point, well, I can tell you this. I'll tell you a story, and with this we'll conclude. There was a woman who was a member of our congregation when I was up at Hanover, New Hampshire. Her name was Betty Lauer, and she wrote a book, which I would encourage everyone to read, called Hiding in Plain Sight. And she was 9 years old at the time. And she lived in Germany. Her father was able to get out and was trying to send for them when one night there was a knock on the door in 1939. It was the Gestapo. And she was rounded up with her mother, who was from Poland, was a dentist. They were Jewish. And they drove them to the border the next day and just dumped them on the border and said, you can't. At the same time that this was going on, the invasion of Poland had begun. And for the next 7 years, she tried to live the life of a Christian, quote, hiding in plain sight. To her credit, she had some Aryan features. She had blonde hair. She was attractive. Her Jewish features were not that prominent, but it's a very gripping and very telling story of what happened on the night of the invasion. And she, along with many others, were rounded up and just dumped. And you just imagine, the German army is coming in and they're bombing and doing all of this. Her sister and her mother end up in Poland. And the Second World War begins, and if I'm not mistaken, England then declared war.
England and France
both declared war on Germany. The United States, going back a little bit, in 1925, began to limit the number of immigrants coming into the United States. From 1880 to 1925, you could immigrate fairly easily from Europe. After 1925, it became very difficult. And of course, after 1939, it became 1940, 1941, it became, very, very, very difficult. 1939, and we'll pick up, is it 12, is it 1:30?
It's 20 to 1, no big deal,
It is 20 to 2?
20 to 2, excuse me.
Okay, that's fine. So we're gonna stop. That's an hour. We're gonna pick,
May I comment one thing?
please.
About the Germans
Mhm.
and their racial theories?
Yes.
What, they did the same thing to the Slavs in Russia.
Oh, the Russians bore the brunt, yeah.
Yeah, and to show that the Nazis were insane. First and foremost, Aryans were in India. That's
They're
where
what?
the Aryan culture arose in India.
Mhm.
If you study all of that, it isn't
Yes,
about
yeah,
Germany.
the swastika symbol.
Yeah, swastika symbol. And they had all these superstitions and all this Nordic crap, excuse my French, but they were just a bunch of crazies. You said they were rational, but their view on, and they wanted Lebensraum, they wanted living space for anybody Germanic. My name's Kettler, so they would have made me a great German. Right? I'm also French and everything else,
Yeah.
where I'm a good American. So the problem with the Germans was that they were a hodgepodge of collection of hate. That's all they were. It's who did they not like? They didn't like anybody but Germans. They hated the French, everybody else.
Yeah.
And the Jews took the brunt.
Yeah, when I say rational, what I mean is that, they had developed what, this one professor said was a pseudoscience. It wasn't really science, obviously, because it was filled with bias and prejudice, and they were going to get a result that they wanted to get. So in that sense, it was a kind of a fake science. But what I'm saying is that once they established what they were about, they rationally put that into effect. We think of the Shoah as a bunch of crazies, and we can certainly, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, because, and I'll leave you with this thought. There was a standing order at Auschwitz with regards to selection. Only a medical doctor could do the selections. Now, think about that if you're a doctor. Like, you're trained, you have something akin to the Hippocratic Oath, which, by the way, changes, I believe, in Germany after Hitler rises to power. But you have somebody who's highly, highly educated. What could possibly make a physician execute that order? How is it that a physician ends up at Auschwitz and feels comfortable making a selection? You can't. I don't believe that the physician is part of that group of crazies. I don't disagree.
Well,
but
you're
how
supposed
is
to
it
do
then?
You do no harm.
What's that?
Do no harm.
But here you have somebody who is rational, who is not crazy, who is standing at the line when they disembark from the train, and this person, a trained medical physician, highly educated person, is making a decision based on just looking at the person, whether they're going to go to the right or left. If they go to, I forget which one is which, but to the right, let's just pretend to his right, they go to the gas chambers and they die. How do you execute? It defies reason to some extent, but yet here we are having a number of rational people be part of this pseudoscience.
The rationality is that you will join the group on the right going to the gas chambers. That's why you do it. And you save, in other words, you're going to save your own life. Because if you don't do it, they're going to get it.
But the evidence shows that those doctors who did not participate in it, they just got reassigned.
Is that right?
Yeah, they didn't die. They weren't sent to the gas chambers for
Well,
refusing.
they needed doctors, of course.
Yeah, they just, they didn't suffer consequences like that. I mean, we're led to believe that, but I'll do more research, but I think that, that, um, that they did not suffer a punishment if they said that's not something.
Well, but they were necessary to have doctors in there. There's no doubt about that.
I think these people did it, I think some of them did it, there's a study, I mean, if you're really interested in this subject about why doctors participated in the Holocaust, there's a book, it's called The Nazi Doctors by, the name begins with an L.
I'll have to look at that.
What's that?
I'll have to look at that.
Thick book, terrible title, terrible title. And he does, and he was a psychoanalyst who, after the war, interviewed doctors who were put on trial and did psychoanalytical sketches, chapters about who these people were and his theory of why they did what they did. And one of his findings, which was interesting, and again, you want to take lessons, you don't want to say, oh, this could never happen here. That's dangerous. But one of the things he found was that in many cases, the physicians had become numb. You do something enough times, you become numb to what it is you're doing. It doesn't bother you anymore. And his theory, one of his theories about some of these physicians, not the Mengeles, the ones that really bought into all of this nonsense and craziness and terrible, was that, I mean, one of his theories is that they just became numb. And that's one of the things that we tried to teach medical students, is the dangers of numbness, the dangers of just not seeing the patient as a human being, but seeing the patient as clinically as just sick. I've got 15 minutes and now I got to go somewhere else. And all of a sudden it becomes about that and not about patient care, underlying the word care. I'm not saying, I mean, that's a systems problem. That's not a human problem. These doctors today, I mean, they mean well and they're all very good, but the way the system works, you can see where a certain element of becoming numb emotionally occurs.
Especially with the specialization.
Yeah, but you also have in our country, and it's a debate, the issue of who gets to live from abortion standpoints. And that's a big thing. I mean, this kid, late term abortion, he doesn't look right. Let's just kill him right out of the womb.
Yeah.
And that's a debate. And it's a very serious debate.
Yeah. I haven't studied late term abortions frequency and under what conditions.
I don't know what it is.
What are the guidelines that determine a late term abortion? It used to be under Roe v. Wade that it had to be, if I understand it correctly, I don't remember the case, that it had to pose a serious threat to the life of the mother, because the state had a vested interest once the child became viable.
Yeah.
That was supposedly the reason, but that's not what it ended up being. It's just whether or not the woman wanted it.
Whether what?
Whether or not the woman wanted it.
And
If she wanted abortion, it didn't matter what.
Yeah.
Gestation.
Yeah, I don't want to get into.
No,
I don't want to get into abortion.
It's somewhere we get into where human beings want to try to play God. And I thought the Nazis and the Christian church in Germany failed mightily to protect the Jewish people. And it's like the Pope once told Stalin he ought to quit killing people. He says, well, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And we get
that's just,
it's just that horrid idea of what we think about human beings. Yeah. We just mash them together as a piece of protoplasm, and we don't look at the individual soul.
Well, that's what I think, Robert, I forget his name, that's what he was really saying. He was saying the human sensitivity becomes like
No.
anything, yeah, it becomes, they're just doing it because it's their job and not thinking morally about what it is that they're doing. That was one of the takeaways, wasn't the only one, it was much more complicated than that.
That's,
We will pick this up next time, okay?
yeah.
We'll start next time really with the Wannsee Conference, and then we'll talk about the massive effort to take the lives of 6 million human
Yeah.
beings.
Or more than that.
Yeah.
I believe it was close to 8 million.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, thank you.
Thank you.
Next week is Passover, so I think it'd be better if we did not meet. I'm gonna be kind of busy right before we have a
Next
Seder
week-
here.
And next week is Easter for us, so.
Yeah, so,
No,
Couple-
next week is Palm Sunday.
No, the week after is what I'm at. The
oh,
week
okay, so maybe we'll pick this up in 3 weeks, maybe
after.
we'll.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay,
Well, that's
thank you.
wonderful.
Thank
You're
you.
bringing back some history.
Yeah, a little